support.
The maestro, please!
I can only imagine that this is going to be the longest pop analysis that we've ever done, because not only are we looking at All Too Well by Taylor Swift, and not only is it the new version, All Too Well Taylor's version, but today we are looking at All Too Well Taylor's version from the vault. The 10-minute version.
Taylor Swift.
Unsurprisingly, this is not the first time we've looked at Taylor Swift. We looked at her alongside Zayn way back when we did.
I don't wanna live forever, 'cause I know
And we looked at her again a couple years ago when we did.
you need to calm down. You're being too loud.
Taylor Swift has continued to top the charts, as she typically does, given she's had a bit of a distinct genre change in her recent chart-topping hits.
And when I felt like I was an old cardigan under someone's bed,
And
life was a willow and it bent right to your wind.
Background.
this new version of All Too Well was released on November 15th, 2021, charting the week after at number 1, where it currently sits as of the end of November. It is the longest song at 10 minutes 13 seconds to ever be number 1, beating out the previous record holder.
Bye, bye, Miss American Pie. Drove my Chevy to the levee, but the levee...
Which is 8 minutes 42 seconds long. There are multiple versions of this song. There's All Too Well Taylor's version, which is 5.5 minutes. There's the version we're looking at, which is 10 minutes and 13 seconds. And then there's a live acoustic version of the 10-minute version that she performed on Saturday Night Live. This version of All Too Well is off of Red, Taylor's version, which was released on November 12, 2021. This is a re-recorded version of her previous album Red, which was initially released on October 22nd back in 2012. Oddly enough, this isn't even the first time she's done this. She's already made Fearless, Taylor's version, which was the first of the re-recorded albums she's releasing. It's a bit of a long story of why she's re-recording all of her earlier albums, but if you want the short version, by re-recording them, she now gets to have all of her masters this time. All Too Well was actually released from Red, Taylor's version as a promotional single. The only actual single that has been released from this version of Red is
And I bet you think about me.
Joining Taylor Swift on this redone version of All Too Well are both Liz Rose and Jack Antonoff. Elizabeth Wagner, aka Liz Rose, was on the first version of All Too Well back in 2012, but she has a number of other country songwriting hits to her name, such as
Like my mother does when I'm scared.
in addition to
I got a girl crush.
Second time we're mentioning Jack Antonoff. We talked about him the first time when we did I Don't Want to Live Forever. Since then, he's gotten a few powerful pop hits to his name, such as
I'm waiting for it, that green light. Oh, I wish I could get my...
and more recently,
Do you get deja vu?
All Too Well Taylor's version is released by Republic Records.
Form.
All Too Well, the 10-minute version, Taylor's version from the vault, is a pop song, is 10 minutes 13 seconds long in C major and 94 beats per minute. After a short instrumental intro, we get the first verse.
I walked to the door with you. The air was cold.
After that, we get another short instrumental break before the second verse.
Oh, your sweet disposition and my wide-eyed gaze.
This then leads us into the first pre-chorus,
And I know it's long gone and that magic's not here no more.
and then the first chorus.
'Cause there we are again on that little town street.
We then get the third verse, which is much longer than the previous two.
Photo album on the counter. Your cheeks were turning red.
Before getting another pre-chorus,
And I forget about you long enough to forget why I need it.
and another chorus, which is longer than the first one.
We're dancing around the kitchen in the refrigerator light.
We then get a bridge,
Maybe we got lost in translation. Maybe I asked for too much, but
and then another verse.
they say all's well that ends well, but I'm in a new hell.
After another short instrumental break, we get a fifth verse.
Time won't fly, it's like I'm paralyzed by it.
We then get our third and final chorus.
Wind in my hair, you were there, you remember it.
A sixth verse.
And I was never good at telling jokes, but the punchline goes.
And then finally the outro.
Just between us did the love affair mean you all to it.
Which then starts to repeat and slowly fade out.
Acoustic guitar.
The driving harmonic force in the song, it simply strums along through almost the entirety of it, and there are some variations, but for the most part, it goes C major, G major, A minor, F major. Like I said, there are some variations, like in this instance, when the F major is actually held out for 2 bars, and it's not done in that consistent 8th note strumming pattern.
Bass guitar.
For the most part, the bass guitar just actually plays along with the acoustic guitar, doing all 8th notes and the root of each chord that the acoustic guitar is playing. C, G, A, F. Near the end of the song, though, it actually changes what it's doing. It still does those 8th notes, but now it is going C, A, F, G.
Piano.
To be fair, it is not just the piano that does this. In fact, there are a lot more instruments throughout this entire song. A mellotron, a flute, a saxophone, a string section, a slide guitar, and what have you. But they're really more of textural elements than any sort of melodic or harmonic one. This, however, is one of the key melodic patterns that any of the instruments play that we mostly hear from the piano.
Verse.
The first of 6 verses, Taylor Swift opens the song very low in her range, not going above the E on the bottom of the staff, and even going as low as the F, way below the staff.
I walked through the door with you. The air was cold, but something about it felt like home somehow.
She continues to stay down there in the second half of the first verse, having these rhythms while still syncopated, very spaced apart, and even going 1 note lower than that F all the way to that E below the staff.
And I left my scarf there at your sister's house, and you still got it in your drawer even now.
When we get into the second verse, she still is staying awfully low in her register, again, never going above the E. However, the rhythms are becoming more and more clumped together, and there's more and more going on rhythmically.
Oh, your sweet disposition and my wide-eyed gaze. We're singing in the car, getting lost upstate.
While her effective range isn't necessarily changing, she is starting to spend more time around that D and E as opposed to the C and lower.
Autumn leaves falling down like pieces into place, and I can picture it after all these days.
As we get to the beginning of the third verse, again, still very low in her range, but we're not getting those low E's as often. In fact, in this phrase, we only hit it once. Also, she is starting to put more and more 16ths, as well as the occasional melisma in her singing.
Photo album on the counter, your cheeks were turning red. You used to be a little kid with glasses in a twin-sized bed.
She continues this trend, but very much emphasizes, again, the lower part of her range, especially those 3 E's near the end of this phrase.
And your mother's telling stories about you on the t-ball team. You told me about your past, thinking your future was me.
As we move into the second half of the third verse, which is twice as long as the previous two, we finally start to move higher in her range, getting to the F on the staff, and now not going below the A below the staff.
And you were tossing me the car keys, fuck the patriarchy, keychain on the ground. We were always skipping town.
She actually continues to go higher, going all the way up to the G this time. And now she actually is hitting that low E at the end as well, which is very much expanding her range, especially in this phrase.
And I was thinking on the drive down, anytime now, he's gonna say it's a love. You never called it what it was.
As we begin to move into the end of the third verse, she does lower her range again, not going above that E. However, we're getting some more emphasis on certain melismas, especially on the word same in this phrase.
Till we were dead and gone and buried, check the pulse and come back swearing it's the same after 3 months in the grave.
As we get to the final phrase in the third verse, again, she is staying lower in her range, not going above the E, but we are getting some more interesting melismas. We get a similar one on shame, and we get a new one on the word frame.
And then you wondered where it went to as I reached for you, but all I felt was shame, and you held my lifeless frame.
Getting to the fourth verse, she is now starting to stay higher in her range. For the most part, that's C to F, although we do hit those low A's and that low B near the end.
They say all's well, it ends well, but I'm in a new hell every time you double cross my mind.
As we continue to move on, she actually holds that range, that low A to that F on the staff, steady, while still doing all of these syncopated rhythms that she's been doing throughout.
You said if we had been closer in age, maybe it would have been fine, and that made me want to die.
You'll notice here that we start to hit that G on the staff a number of times, starting to really actually push her range up to where we know Taylor Swift can easily sing. Also, we have a lovely low melisma at the end of this phrase, going from A to B to C.
The idea you had of me, who was she? A never needy, ever lovely jewel, whose shine reflects on you.
She continues to hit the G on the staff, very much establishing we are moving higher in her range, and she repeats a similar melisma at the end, going A to B, but then doing this lovely EFE figure to end the melisma on U.
Not we've been in a party bathroom, some actress asking me what happened. You, that's what happened to you.
As we near the end of the fourth verse, she starts to lower her range again, and her rhythms become less focused on sixteenths and become more focused on eighth notes, especially near the end doing those syncopated quarter notes on Late Night Show, ending at that low A, given she hit that low G earlier in the phrase.
You who charmed my dad with self-effacing jokes, sipping coffee like you're on a late night show.
She then ends the fourth verse very similarly to how a lot of the other verses have been, in that narrow C to E range, actually the most narrow we've seen so far. The only note outside of that is the 1B and the 1A in the first couple bars.
But then he watched me watch the front door all night, willing you to come, and he said it's supposed to be fun, turning 21.
Moving on to the fifth verse, we have these spaced out syncopated rhythms, and again, very much emphasizing the bottom of her range.
Time won't fly, it's like I'm paralyzed by it. I'd like to be my old self again, but I'm still trying to find it.
She then quickly starts to expand it though, going back to that high G, the highest note she's hit in the verses thus far, but more focusing on eighth note rhythms on the back half as opposed to sixteenths in the beginning.
After plaid shirt days and nights when you made me your own, now you mail back my things and I walk home alone.
One of the few phrases in the verses that actually is entirely on the staff, minus the occasional middle Cs.
But you keep my old scarf from that very first week, 'cause it reminds you of innocence and it smells like me.
Of course, then she returns to those spaced out syncopated rhythms that are very low in her range, albeit the low B is not as low as she's gone before.
You can't get rid of it, 'cause you remember it all too well.
Getting into the sixth and final final verse very much opens on these repeated Fs in the very beginning, but is still going as low as those Gs.
And I was never good at telling jokes, but the punchline goes, I'll get older, but your lovers stay my age.
Oddly enough, she tends to continue this trend of the focus around the Fs and the Gs being the lowest and the F being the highest.
From when your Brooklyn broke my skin and bones, I'm a soldier who's returning half her weight.
At this point, she actually starts focusing more on eighth notes and quarter notes, and in fact, we have a bar that's just quarter notes.
And did the twin flame bruise paint you blue? Just between us, did the love affair maim you too?
As we near the end of all of the verses, and to be fair, the song, she very much starts to focus on almost eighth and quarter note rhythms exclusively.
'Cause in this city's barren cold, I still remember the first fall of snow.
And as we get to the final phrase in the final verse, we get the lowest notes she sings in the entire song, the D an octave below the staff.
And how it glistened as it fell, I remember it all too well.
Pre-chorus.
Unlike the verses, the pre-chorus has a bit more energy to it, as honestly it should, as it's transitioning us to the chorus. The lowest note it ever hits is that low A, but it only hits it once, and she's already hitting Gs. So in all honesty, it's in the pre-chorus that we hear our first high note being that G on long.
And I know it's long gone, and that magic's not here no more. And I might be okay, but I'm not fine at all.
Following that, she does this melisma on O, going A for 2 beats, B for 2 beats, and C for 2.5 beats. The second pre-chorus kind of repeats the same idea melodically speaking. There are some changed rhythms for changed words. The high note is still the G, but the low note is now that middle C, as we never get the low A that we got in the first one.
And I know it's long gone, and there was nothing else I could do. And I forget about you long enough to forget why I need it.
She does the same melisma as well, going A, B, C, given it's on the word to now as opposed to the word O.
Chorus.
Similarly to the pre-chorus, the effective range is pretty much C to G. However, we hit the G much more often in the chorus than we ever did in the pre-chorus.
'Cause there we are again on that little town street. You almost ran the red 'cause you were looking over at me.
She then starts to give us this sort of melodic motif, that C, D, E on those repeated eighth notes. Sometimes they're syncopated, but again, it's very much that C, D, E.
Wind in my hair, I was there. I remember it all too well.
When we get to the second chorus, it is essentially the same minus some changes in words, still very much focusing around the G on the staff.
Here we are again in the middle of the night. We're dancing around the kitchen in the refrigerator light.
And again, we get that C, D, E motif, given the words are slightly different, but again, it is still those eighth notes on C, D, and E.
Down the stairs, I was there. I remember it all too well.
In the second half of the second chorus, we actually open up on the G, staying there for quite a while, only hitting that middle C occasionally.
And there we are again when nobody had to know. You kept me like a secret, but I kept you like an oath.
And once again, the C, D, E in the eighth notes, and to be fair, we've also still been getting that E, B, G on All Too Well, the name of the song, given the rhythms and how long she's held at each individual note have shifted slightly throughout.
Sacred prayer, and we'd swear to remember it all too well.
Moving on to the third chorus, very much again sticking to those syncopated Gs, and now we're hitting that middle C even less. We only hit it twice in this phrase.
'Cause there we are again when I loved you so. Back before you lost the one real thing you've ever known.
But as always, those C, D, E eighth notes, as well as the E, B, C endings on All Too Well, given they're much more spaced out now.
It was rare, I was there. I remember it all too well.
As we wrap up the final chorus now, we have moved a bit lower, but that's because we're now focusing exclusively on those C, D, E eighth note rhythms, going off Wind in My Hair and then Down the Stairs, the first two that we heard in the song.
Wind in my hair, you were there, you remember it all. Down the stairs, you were there, you remember it all.
The final chorus ends, however, returning back to what we've heard before, the C, D, E eighth notes and the E, B, C on All Too Well.
It was rare, I was there, I remember it all too well.
Bridge.
The bridge, which in this case is in the middle of the song as opposed to on the end, opens up very much focusing around F and G with 16th note syncopation.
Well, maybe we got lost in translation. Maybe I asked for too much, but maybe this thing was a masterpiece till you tore it all up.
We then get an interesting version of what we heard in the chorus. We still get those C, D, E on the eighth notes, but that All Too Well is now for the most part just held on G.
Running scared, I was there, I remember it all too well.
We then get the highest note in the song, the C on the staff, as opposed to the middle C below, heavily syncopated on 16th offbeats.
And you call me up again just to break me like a promise. So casually cruel in the name of being honest.
The bridge then ends transitioning to eighth notes for the most part, a couple of 16ths in there, but now we get a reverse of the C, D, E motif we got on eighth notes before. The words all actually do that motif in reverse, going E, D, C.
I'm a crumpled up piece of paper lying here, 'cause I remember it all, all, all.
Outro.
Once we get to the end of the song, we start to slow down. We start off on that F, but we are starting to work our way down in her range. Also, we are now starting to focus more on eighth notes as opposed to 16th notes.
Just between us did the love affair maim you all too well.
She then repeats that, still lower in her range, and some altered rhythms for the changed words, but notice how All Too Well those melismas are all very low in her range, which before, her melismas were typically higher.
Just between us, do you remember it all too well?
As we finally start to wrap up the song, we get this very prominent layer over Taylor Swift's main vocals. As she finishes off her line, we get these repeated eighth note rhythms that we got before. Given they're not going C, D, E, or even E, D, C, they're just kind of repeating the same notes as they work their way down from C all the way to A.
Just between us, I remember it all too well.
The layered vocals then continue without Taylor Swift, repeating those same 3 eighth note motifs, but the melody is now just slowly moving down as each time they repeat the same note 3 times before moving down.
Down the stairs, I was there, I was there. Say the prayer, I was there, I was there.
As this continues, we do get one more All Too Well from Taylor Swift, given it's a bit more buried at this point, before the layered vocals repeat this same cycle and everything slowly fades out.
It was rare, you remember it all too well. In my head, I was there, I was there.
There's a number of things I could talk about with this song. I could talk about Taylor Swift and just no matter what she does, of course she's going to have chart-topping songs. We could talk about her re-recording all of these things and how they're actually quite faithful reproductions, or just the fact that she's re-recording them to get her masters, or even the fact that this is over 10 minutes of musical material in one cohesive song. Honestly, after going through all of this stuff regarding this song, you might say that I might know this song a bit
Too well, yeah. 'Cause there we are again when I loved you so. Back before you lost the one real thing you've ever known.
Not gonna lie, I actually did consider just doing the shorter version of this song initially, because Billboard just combined the data from the normal version and the 10-minute version of All Too Well, Taylor's version. But I looked at the numbers both on Spotify and YouTube, and I think we can both clearly see what is really driving All Too Well's chart position.
It was rare, I was